Okay, well, we're starting to talk about, what bricks are, what colours, what creates their colours and texture, etc. The first thing to realise is, well, it's all fairly obvious. Bricks are made of clay. So what's clay? Well, geologically, it's a material where you've got thin slivers of silica and alumina with water in between. And this gives it its malleability and mouldability. The water acts as a slip plane, so it means you can mould the clay into various shaped units. But the content of water, it takes up volume, and so as the brick dries, it shrinks, and then as it fires, it shrinks further. So if you want a brick of a particular size, you need to know how much the clay shrinks, so you can finish up with that exact size. And so this first box here, you can see we've got a coping brick. It's for quite a wide wall, but it really does emphasize the amount of shrinkage. The clay originally filled this box completely when it was wet. It's dried and shrunk, and then in firing it shrunk that little bit more. Most clays shrink anywhere between 10 and 13%, depending on the geological deposit. So that has to be borne in mind. So when the brick mould is made, it's made oversized to allow for that shrinkage. And each area of clay is different. So each brickworks has a slightly different amount of shrinkage with their clay. So here we've got this brick is well dried now. It was made probably about 30 years ago now, from the same mould as this. That's just been dried, that's been fired, and if we hold the two together, can you see that we've got shrinkage even between the drying and the firing stage? Not as so much in width, but in length, we've lost another sort of nearly 1/4 of an inch on that between the two stages. Well, the early bricks were made in a mould, and they were then put out to dry in a drying field, usually on grass, dry grass or straw. And you can see this is quite an early chimney brick. It's quite a thin one. It's virtually sort of a tile, but a thick tile. It's not what, when we look at a modern brick, there's quite a bit of difference in the thickness of the two. And so this is going back more than likely into the 14th century, that particular brick, being used in a chimney and fireplace arrangement. Okay, so we've got our brick, it's dried, we then fire it, and the firing basically starts to melt the silica within the clay. And so what you're really producing is it's like a glass-like material. It's the silica is bonding everything together, and if you put a certain amount of heat in, probably about 1,000 degrees, you get a brick like this, and you can hear it sort of rings fairly sort of dull thud. If you carry on putting heat into it, that silica begins to melt and flow, and you can see that this brick has been sat on 3 others. The way it's what's called stacking in the kiln, and it started to flow, and on this side you can see it's begun to melt, and so you're getting sort of a glass-like surface to it. And so that's probably been up at about 1,100 degrees rather than round about the 1,000, probably even 1,200. If you keep putting heat into the kiln, the bricks will totally melt down, and you'll finish up with something like that, which is very sort of hard and glass-like material. So it's a matter of getting a balance between temperature and sort of hardness of the brick. So hand moulding the brick, the clay is thrown into the mould, and the mould sits on what's known as a stock board. So that's the base. They're sanded, dampened and sanded so that the clay doesn't stick. The clay's thrown in, and then the excess is cut off with a bow with a wire, and you then pick the mould up, tap it, and that loosens the brick, and you can turn it out onto a loose board. That process of making a brick by hand, a good brick maker could make a brick in about 18 seconds and turn it out onto his brick barrow. So they were paid piecework, so it was in their own interest, the hand makers in the past, to produce their bricks fairly quickly. And many of them started at sort of 6 o'clock in the morning, and by lunchtime they'd done their quota and then relaxed by playing football or whatever. Talking to an old brickmaker a few years ago from Wadden near Salisbury, and he was telling the stories of what they got up to in their youth, etc. These itinerant brickmakers. Okay, so hand making bricks, you've got a brick which fired just over 1,000 degrees, and it's a fairly softish brick. If you want something that will stand up to a fair amount of pressure, if you're building a large structure like a viaduct or something like that, you want a brick which is more tenacious. And so you're looking at an engineering brick. Well, how do you produce one of those? Well, when they started to machine produce bricks, the actual sort of machine production and the way that the bricks were extruded, you were putting on about 80 tons pressure on the clay to force it through the nozzle of the extruder, and that really sort of created a fairly dense-ish brick. So here we've got a wire cut brick. So this was extruded and then wire cut, and this is a semi-engineering brick fired up at probably about 1,075 degrees. And you can hear it rings much denser. If you want an even more tenacious brick, you then take that and you put it in a large press, and it's pressed under tremendous pressure, and that gives you an engineering brick, a repressed brick. And again, you can hear how dense that one is. And these repressed bricks were used for basically for engineering work. You're getting probably half as much clay again into the same shape and size, so that's sort of creating a great sort of density. Today the engineering bricks are made under even greater pressure and then fired to quite a high temperature, and the sand, the moulding sand on the surface actually melts and fuses, and one gets a brick which is so dense it's virtually waterproof. And if you try and lay a lot of these, they tend to float, so you can only do 2 or 3 courses at a time because they tend to float. You know, they don't absorb any moisture at all, and that's tremendously heavy. So if I can just pass that across, it comes with a health and safety warning, it is heavy. Okay. Well, where do these sort of bricks get used historically? Well, some of you recognise this sort of brick. Sometimes they've got sort of a diamond pattern on them. Okay, they're a stable block. These blocks were used, on the ground for taking wear and taking weather. And again, they're fired at a high temperature. Now you'll notice that this brick is a very dark colour. It's virtually black. And we come to sort of what gives the brick its colour and its character. Well, a lot depends on what's in the clay. Some clays react in different ways when they're fired. So we have a brick that's produced from a shaly clay, and this gives you something that's fairly characterless. This is a London Brick Company brick. They're produced in the Peterborough area, have been for right through the 20th century, and the clay contains a lot of shale, and that shale helps the bricks to fire. It's sort of a natural fuel within the clay, And so once they've got to about 600 degrees centigrade in the kilns, these bricks will continue and fire themselves. Now, the problem with these shaly bricks, you can't use them below ground. If you try to, you finish up with, you know, a wheaty brick rather than a, anything decent. They take moisture and salts fairly quickly and they'll break down. Some of the shale clays are quite good. This one is an extruded one, and it's being fired at the same temperature alongside that handmade brick that's been handed round. It's only reached about 1,000, the kiln only reached just over 1,000 degrees, but this continued burning alongside the handmade brick, and you can hear it's fired up to a much higher temperature. It's much denser. Okay, so what gives the brick its colour? Well, it's the trace elements within the clay, and the most common one is iron. And if the clay is iron rich, you'll get a reddish colour produced on firing, but that can range from oranges right through to sort of darker heather colours, depending on the atmosphere within the kiln. If there's lots of oxygen in the kiln when the bricks are being fired, you get the iron being oxidised, so you get the ferrous oxide being created, which gives you the reddish colour. If you burn the kiln very efficiently and there's a lack of oxygen in the kiln, you get what's known as a reducing atmosphere, and you get the ferric oxide, which is very dark. And so this gives you your darker coloured bricks right the way through to virtually black. So the red and orange bricks have been oxidised, the much darker coloured bricks have been reduced. And just to illustrate that, we've got here a brick that was fired in a kiln, and when we slice it in half and have a look at the cross section, you can see it's got a grey, nearly black sort of heart to it, but the outside has got sort of a flash of red colour. And this is because it was fired in a kiln with a reducing atmosphere, and then at the end of the firing, through a crack in the wall of the kiln, oxygen's got in and it's changed the colour of this brick. The iron here has been oxidised in this brick on the surface, and you've got this red coloured brick. Again, we've got here a brick which the clay, when it's reduced in a reducing atmosphere, is yellow, and when it's in an oxidising atmosphere, it's got a sort of orangey, sort of a pinkish colour to it. And so you've got both colours there, as it's been in a kiln near a crack through the wall of the kiln. So we can get a whole range of colours, and in fact these bricks are all out of the same kiln load. Okay, depending on the position in the kiln, the way that the heat and the gas flows are going through the kiln, you're getting both oxidised and reduced bricks. So this was sort of normal in historic kilns, and so the bricks were coming out and they're being sorted on site. And if you're building a nice Georgian house, you'd pick these sort of slightly darker cherryish red bricks for the facade, and different colours sort of round the back, probably a few light oranges, but the really soft fired oranges that you can mark with your fingernail, they go into the interior walls, okay, where they're not having to take lots of weather. So it always amuses me when people are doing a house renovation, and the builder's instructed to very carefully take the bricks down and clean them from the interior walls for repairing, the facade of the building. So you're taking the absolute rubbish that was rejected by the original builder and using it for repairing the outside of your house. The other thing you'll find with the bricks are that some of them, you get the bricks themselves multicoloured like this. And this is the way that they've been set in the kiln, where one brick's been set on top of another, with gaps in between for the heat to flow through the bricks. And in some cases there's been no oxygen, where the brick's been on top of another brick, it's been devoid of oxygen, so it's gone dark. In other areas where there was an open flame path, lots of oxygen going through the kiln, you get the red colour. So you can get bricks striped in that way. So you can tell the way that they were stacked in the kiln. Sometimes you get the lines going across diagonally, and that was known as skintle setting within the kiln. So by just looking at a brick, you can tell a lot about the way it was made. You'll also see that this brick, if I put it the right way up here, it's got sort of a creasing in it that's sort of a smile. And this is because when you throw the clay into the mould, as it gets towards the bottom of the mould, it slows up, and round the edges of the mould again you've got greater friction, and so this is why you get this sort of creasing with the sand, the moulding sand within the mould, etc. Some moulds, some bricks have got a frog in them. You can see there the frog. Okay, that's nothing to do with adding sort of friction when you're laying the brick, you know, to key them together. Originally it was a function of the way the bricks were made. This bit in the bottom is what's known as a kick, and the idea was that it overcame this steadying up of the clay as it got to the bottom of the mould. It forced the clay out to the corners, and so you got nice sharp edges to your brick, rather than sort of a slightly sort of dullish roundish bottom to the brick. So that was the function of the frog. Okay, nothing to do with keying or getting you to use more mortar. Okay, well, some bricks like this, you know, look real horrors. They've sort of got dark speckles all over them, and you'll find a lot of these in the sort of Surrey, Sussex border, that sort of area. And these are the clamp-fired bricks, and what this is fuel that's been put into the clay, anything up to sort of 10% coal dust, and as it's fired it's left these sort of dark speckles in the brick, and they're quite high fired. You know, they're really good for weathering, etc., but just look awful. Our Bewley bricks, so this is a clay that's had all the iron leached out of it, so when it fires you get this lovely sort of lemony colour. Nobody's sort of producing these today in this area, so if you want to match up a Bewley brick, it's quite a problem. On the continent some of the clays are firing this sort of lighter colour, but a few years ago we had to match up bricks for a building and having an extension on it, and we needed sort of a darkish yellowish coloured brick, and so in fact these two bricks are produced from the same clay at the Swanage Brickworks. That's the clay as dug and used and fired. This one has had up to 30% crushed chalk added to it, and this has killed the iron, the oxidisation of the iron. It's been fired in a reducing atmosphere and it's produced this sort of lemony coloured brick. So the brick makers can play around with what they're doing in order to create a slightly different colour to their bricks. Now historically some bricks finished up with sort of a glaze to them, a natural glaze, and a lot of these were used as headers to create diaper patterns in brickwork, particularly in the 16th and 17th century, and then became popular again in the 19th century. And these are naturally occurring glazes, which basically it's a wood-fired kiln, and the wood ash is acting as a flux to melt the moulding sand that's on the outside of the brick and forming sort of a glass-like surface. And if what they did eventually was to, when they were making these bricks, was to stack them in a particular way in the kiln, so all the head of the bricks were in the flue, the flame path, and at the end of the firing, when they got to their 1025 degrees or whatever, they flash through the kiln with very dry material, usually hazel or something of that nature, or silver birch, for about half an hour. And that rapidly lifted the head of the bricks to a higher temperature. It melted the sand on the ends of the bricks to form this sort of glass-like material, and because these rapid flames were going through, it was burning out all the oxygen, and you got a reducing atmosphere, so the end of the bricks were sort of black. You can see to some extent this sort of grey colour here on a brick from the Victorian period. If you want to match these sort of glazed, or what's known as vitrified headers today, the brickmaker will simply cut a brick in half once it's been fired, and he'll dip it in a potter's glaze, and depending on how much glaze goes on it, he then refires it in an electric kiln, and you can get this sort of range of colours produced sort of artificially to create your headers, your vitrified headers for repairs. Well, so much then for the sort of standard bricks. For decorative purposes, moulding of bricks started again in the 16th century with moulds like this. This is a copy of an 18th century moulded brick with this sort of egg and dart decoration to it. But basically, if you wanted to get sort of special shaped bricks, one way of doing it from the 16th century onwards was to make a brick which was oversized like this, of clay that's been well sieved so there's no bits of grit and rubbish in it, and so you fire this to just over the 900 degrees, so it's only just sort of brick, it's only just ceramic, and so it's very soft, and this means it's very easy to cut and rub. And so with a couple of twisted wires together like that in a frame, just put a bit of tension on it. If I just wind this up a little bit, you can then use that, and you can see we're actually cutting the brick. And so in good Blue Peter fashion, you know, there's one I did the other day, and it will also rub with either a harder brick or stone, or in this case it's a carborundum stone, and you can rub it and get a perfect surface to it. And so this was used, particularly in the Georgian period, for producing this system, for producing their rubbed brick arches. So these arches, the joints in between, probably no more than 1 or even 2 millimetres wide, with a very fine lime, sand lime mortar in between. And these are a complete brick, an oversized brick, and you marked out where you wanted the joints to make it look absolutely precise. And these joints are just indented into the surface by, you know, sort of a 1/4 inch or so, and then you tuck your lime mortar in. So it's all sort of false jointed work with these very fine joints here. And in the London area they were doing the same with the London stock bricks. You got these sort of yellowy coloured arches. So you could cut and rub this material, and you could get a perfectly precise brick like this. And when you built that in a panel with very, very fine joints, the eye reads the joints and not the brick, and so you seem to have an area of brick, complete brick, without virtually any joints. And so this is what's known as gauged work. Every brick was rubbed to exactly the same size. You can put a set square on it and it's perfectly rectangular material. And so cut and rubbed work. You could also make shapes. If you had a box, and on the end of the box you had a metal profile, the shape of the moulding you wanted to make, you could then run your saw along your wire and actually cut that shape. And so that's the way that they made these sort of cornice bricks, etc. So a lot of that was done in the 16th and into the 17th century. In the 18th century it was mainly brick arches, and then this gauging of brickwork came back again towards the end of the 19th century for very posh, expensive buildings. The other way of getting decorative bricks was to do it in a mould, and you wanted a very, very fine clay, and the moulds were made quite often with something like lime wood, so you could get very, very sharp sort of detailing. And if you fill that completely with clay, some of the moulds were quite large, it would be a very heavy, very dense block, which would take a long time to dry and fire. And so what we finished up with was these sort of terracotta, decorative terracotta blocks, which when you look at the back, they're hollowed out. They've got fixing points, so you could use metal dowels to tie everything together, metal cramps, and quite often they were filled with a lightweight lime concrete. And so this sort of terracotta cladding type material became very popular in the 19th century, and in America, where they sort of developed the skyscrapers, the steel frame buildings, etc., many of them were encased with this sort of lightweight decorative material, so the terracotta, which was sort of high fired. So some of the sort of 20-story high skyscrapers in America, the cornice blocks are probably nearly as big as this table, but they're lightweight because they're hollow block and they're fixed back with these metal fittings. Yeah. For roughly shaping, they sometimes used a brick axe like this with a soft orange brick, and they cut roughly the shape they wanted, and then they do a lime render on it. So some things like sort of window openings and mullions, etc., you could roughly carve and then just lime plaster on top. Well, today, if you want a special shaped brick, say for something like a bay window, you go along to the brickworks and they say, oh yes, yeah, to get something like that, we've got to make a special mould up, etc. Well, it's 300 quid to make the mould, and so on and so forth. And how many do you want, sir? 5, so it gets quite expensive. So what they might offer you is sticker brick, and basically it's 2 bricks and they've just sliced it to the angle and then glued it together with an epoxy resin. And it's guaranteed to last until the time the builder gets to the end of the drive, A bit of moisture and a bit of frost in there, and it does tend to sort of break there. So basically there's no replacement really for the real deal. Other interesting things on the table here. This brick, you wouldn't like to lay many of those in a day, would you? Okay. We can date this brick fairly precisely. It's a tax avoidance brick. When the brick tax came in, the brick makers said, okay, if we're being taxed by the brick, we'll make them bigger. And so 2 years later, the government brought out a maximum volume for a brick, and if it exceeded that, you were charged double the tax. And so that killed these oversized bricks. So we can date that within 2 or 3 years of the brick tax being enacted. Occasionally one gets bricks for sort of special events. This is a pavia brick pavia, been in the paving for years. It's only when you lift it and see on the back, King George V, 1910. It's a commemoration brick for his coronation. Other odd things. Any offers on that? Made in Blackpool, right through the middle? No. Stick of rock? No. It's not a mullion. It's a pavia for a kitchen or scullery floor. and you put a series of those together, you know. And that was actually made near at the little brickworks that was there, Rockingham, the Rockingham brickworks. Yes, I mentioned mathematical tiles earlier, and there we've got a couple of examples. This one's actually from one of the leached clays, so it's got a nice sort of yellowy colour, and it's also been glazed. And again, if you go into Sussex to Lewes, you'll find all sorts of colours, dark blues, blacks and so on, tiles like that. So that's the mathematical tiles. Real problem one. Any offers? It's got a stamp on it. It was made Poole by Jennings of Poole. It's a wall tie. Early cavity walls, you need it to tie the two walls together with something that didn't rust, and so this is a non-rusting early cavity wall tie. And the reason you don't see them is that on the outside you've got a brick slip which covers them. So it's only when you take a building apart do you sort of discover these. They were fairly short-lived. You know, the metal wall ties tended to, you know, sort of overtake them because they're expensive to make. And you'll see it's got sort of a brownish sort of glaze on, which probably might remind you of something. Sanitary ware, yes, drain pipes. Yeah, it's a salt glaze. So at the end of the firing, you threw a few shovelfuls of salt into the kiln, and that volatilized to give you this sort of glazed effect. Now banned, because if you get downwind, it can be very dangerous to your health. It's highly carcinogenic, the vapours that come off. And there we've got another patent wall tie. That's a London one, and you can see it's got this sort of drip point here for the within the cavity, and the two skins of brickwork ran through at that point. Again, something locally made. Drain, that's it, a land drain. And again, these were extruded. This one's from Pilewell, from the brickworks there on the shore. They're still sort of, you find them in the undergrowth and on the foreshore where they dropped off whatever they're being carried on. And it's been extruded. You can see the lines in it here where it's gone through the nozzle, and the nozzle had a pin in the centre which made it hollow. So early sort of extruded ware. The other thing we've got on the table here is path edgings, and again these were coming in the Victorian period, particularly with steam power, and these tended to be pressed to get the designs and decoration on them. And just finally, we've got here something that many a Victorian house had in their porch or up the hall. These are the encaustic tiles. They were sort of a Victorian copy of the medieval church floor tile. They're made by Minton and Hollins, this particular one, and basically they used a stamp to stamp out the design. They then filled it with a cream firing clay and then glazed it, and that gave you your sort of decoration. Okay, so that's basically covered what we've got on the table here, other than just finally the glazed bricks coming in at the end of the 19th century. This is the old Poole pottery that used to be on the quay there. They started off producing not just pots but also architectural ceramics, and so many a Victorian pub had various coloured glazed bricks on their frontage. And this was a clay from Devon, and Cornwall, this very white firing china clay material, and then it's got a potter's glaze on the surface, and they came in various colours. As long as they're in a lime mortar, they're fine. Yeah. Somebody asked me previously about lime today. You can get lime from specialist suppliers. There's a good one just on the Salisbury Road called Lime Stuffs. Your ordinary builders merchants, if you ask for a bag of lime, they'll probably give you a bag of hydrated lime, which is used as a plasticizer by builders in with cement to get it flow even quicker off the trowel. What you need is a hydraulic lime, and that comes in various hardnesses, various settings. For most brickwork, I'd use an NHL2. That means it gains 2 newtons of strength over a period of time under laboratory conditions, and that's plenty hard enough. Traditionally, it would simply be a lime that's burnt and then left in a pit to mature, and it's a sort of a putty lime which hardens by the absorption of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. When we do plasters, etc., I'll talk a little bit more about the sort of chemistry behind limes and the different sorts of limes. I've had all on to sort of fit brick into, you know, this evening's session. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Good.